Okay, so in this lesson, I want to look at this idea within nature, and it's step 7, let's say, within the study of habitats. So step 7, and it relates to like looking at adaptation. So adaptation. So really, like what this kind of relates to is how do organisms, how are they adapted to survive, let's say, within their particular environment? So adaptation, that's what we mean. So we look at it, what's the official definition of adaptation? So adaptation. So what is it? So it is the way an organism is suited to survive in its environment. So it so it's the way an organism is suited to survive in its environment. So it's a way. So basically, so it's the way an organism is suited to survive within its environment. So it has certain characteristics, for example, that make it thrive within its particular environment. And we look at maybe just some examples of this. So if we take, like, let's say, like the habitat. So if we look at the habitat, if we look at the, let's say, example of plants, adaptations, an example of animal adaptations. So if we think about, for example, so an example of a particular type of habitat would be the hedgerow. So the hedgerow. And let's say within that, if you think about, for example, you've probably come across nettles. So nettles, so like what do nettles do? If you touch them, they're going to sting you. So they have these stinging hairs. And those stinging hairs are there to prevent nettles from being eaten by certain animals. So for example, so an adaptation then, nettles, they have stinging hairs. And what does that do? So it prevents, these stinging hairs would be an example of the adaptation. And what they do is they protect the plant. So they protect, so for example, they protect nettles. So we all know nettles, they have, if you touch them, they're going to sting you. And nettles, you'll find them along hedgerows. So you'll see them. So that's like their habitat. So this is the organism or the plant, which are nettles, and they have these stinging hairs, and the stinging hairs are there to protect them. Within the hedgerow as well, you have these what are called peacock butterflies. So peacock butterflies. And these peacock butterflies, so they have these really kind of long tubular mouthpieces. So they have these like long, like kind of mouthpieces, and what they do is they allow them to like reach down deep into plants, and they're able to use these mouthpieces to these tubular mouthpieces to eat nectar, for example, or to suck up nectar. So they have long. So tube-like mouthpiece. So they have these long tube-like mouthpieces, and this basically enables them to get access to nectar, for example. So the long tubular mouthpiece, this would be an example of an adaptation. And we'll just look at just one other type. So if we take, for example, grassland, so this is the habitat, grassland. And within that grassland, we have these buttercups. And they're kind of like a yellow type of plant. So they have yellow petals. So these yellow petals are an adaptation that this particular plant has. And what that does is it attracts, the yellow petals attract, they attract pollinators. So basically they attract these pollinators, so they're insects, and basically it helps this particular plant, buttercup, to spread its pollen. So, and these yellow petals, they are perfectly adapted, and what they do is they attract particular types of insects that then are able to spread around their pollen. Then if we take, for example, animals, let's say just within grasslands or just grass plains, you have earthworms. And earthworms, so if you take their color, for example, so they have it, they're dark in color. For camouflage. So they have this kind of dark color, and that gives them camouflage. It stops them, they're not as visible to predators. So as a result, this adaptation of dark colors, for example, mean that they stay safe and predators can't see them. So if predators can't see them, they can't actually eat them, for example. So therefore, this adaptation of the dark color gives them the advantage of them being camouflaged from predators, for example. So really, if we think about it, so these adaptations, they apply to particular organisms, let's say, within an environment. And basically what it means is that, like, for example, if you have, like these peacock butterflies, they have access to nectar that other organisms within the environment wouldn't have access to. So because they have access, they will survive longer. So they'll survive longer in their environment. If they survive longer in their environment, they're more likely to reproduce. And if they reproduce, this trait or this adaptation will be passed on to their offspring. And then they'll have the benefit of, if the environment stays the same, that they'll have access to this nectar as well. So we say that an organism is adapted if it has the qualities that enable it to survive in its surroundings. So for example, its surroundings will give it its surroundings will offer certain challenges to the particular organism, and if they have adaptations that enable them to survive, then that means that they're going to have an advantage. And if they have an advantage, they will survive and thrive within their environment, and as a result of that, they'll be able to reproduce. And if they reproduce, that particular adaptation or trait can then be passed on to their offspring, for example. And adaptations will involve changes or adjustments in the structure and behavior of organisms in order for them to be able to survive in its particular habitat. So for example, like if we take nettles, for example, so they develop these stinging hairs, and these stinging hairs are a structural change to the organism, and as a result of that, it gives them protection from being eaten by certain other animals. And again, sometimes it might be behavior, so animals might learn a new behavior, for example, and that behavior will give them an advantage within the particular environment that they're in. But generally what happens is you get some kind of physical change and that can result in them having they're going to be more likely to survive within a particular environment. Like for example, if you take polar bears, their hide is pretty thick, and that thickness in hide gives them, it's an adaptation, and that allows them to be able to survive in extreme cold. Whereas if you had other brown bears, for example, they don't have that same thickness of hide, and as a result of that, they would die within that environment. Now, if you were to take that same adaptation, so if you were to take a polar bear and put it into like a really hot, like desert type country, that adaptation would be a disadvantage to the animal, because what would happen is it wouldn't be able to cool down, and if it wasn't able to cool down, it would overheat, and if it overheats, its body isn't going to function properly, and it'll die as well. So these adaptations are, they go in line with the environment that the organism is in. So when you are studying your habitat and you get to this step, let's say within the study of the habitat, when you've like identified your plants and identified your animals, for example, in the particular environment, you want to kind of look at their features and see, like, is there what kind of adaptations do they have, and what benefit do those adaptations give to the particular organism? So that's kind of like just, it's a little bit more in-depth study then in relation to when you've identified the plants and animals as well. You want to kind of look at the types of adaptations that are there, and just be able to kind of identify them and talk about like what adaptations are. So that's the whole idea of adaptations in relation to the study of a habitat. So hopefully that makes sense, and thank you for listening.